I think most of us know this quote. If you tell a lie big enough and keep repeating it, people will eventually come to believe it. Joseph Goebbels, Minister of Propaganda of the Third Reich. It's what comes afterwards that's less well known. The truth, he said, is the mortal enemy of the lie, and thus by extension, the truth is the greatest enemy of the state. Every government engages in spin, the art of putting facts in the best possible light. But as many pundits have observed, the kind of outright lying that's occurring in this political climate has upended the rules of engagement. We are living in a post-truth period, a time in which Rudy Giuliani can casually claim that the truth is not the truth. We are living in a state of systematic, intentional lying, not just here in the US, but in plenty of countries around the world. It's hardly an exaggeration to equate what's happening right here, right now, with a running history of totalitarian states. Because the essential quality of totalitarianism, its very hallmark, is lying. Americans have always assumed it can't happen here, that somehow we're immune, the Constitution makes us exempt from what has come to pass elsewhere. But lying, according to Hannah Arendt, makes everything conceivable because nothing is true. What's scary about the time that we're living in is that we've moved beyond lying to Orwellian newspeak, where up is down, the undocumented person is basically an unperson, and alternate facts, as Kellyanne Conway calls them, are the coin of the realm. We are subjected to a language meant to manipulate and distort. Demagoguery that's flagrantly intended to fire up the base. And as we've seen in the last couple of days, with the mailing of explosive devices to critics of the administration, it has accomplished exactly that. Because words matter. So it's not surprising that journalism has become a lightning rod, that what you watch and what you read has become code for who you are and what you stand for. I got a taste of this a few months ago when I met a friend at a Trisco at the De Vargas Mall. The restaurant was, as usual, very busy, and the two of us sidled up to the bar trying to find a seat when an older woman graciously made room for us. My friend thanked her and joked that, "I need a drink after watching CNN." The woman's response, "Well, I watch Fox." And that was that. The pleasantries were over, no room to meet in the middle, much less over margaritas. The irony is that the press today is probably the only institution that's functioning the way it's meant to. Yes, journalism has had its share of big liars, people like Janet Cook, Jason Blair, Stephen Glass. But they are the outliers, the exceptions who were banished as soon as their transgressions were discovered. More alarming, I think, is the blurring of the line between news and entertainment, for the battle for ratings, and as people tune in to just hear their own views reinforced. We all know this, and that's not what I want to talk about here. Instead, I want to talk about the process of journalism, as it's traditionally been practiced and still is practiced in hundreds, if not thousands, of newsrooms around the country. Mine is one of those. Searchlight New Mexico is a nonprofit, foundation-funded investigative news organization. We're part of the national movement that's filling the void as newsrooms shrink and slash their staffs. We are a small organization, 3 reporters, a database editor, an executive editor, that's me, an executive director, Rob Dean, and photographer, Don Usner. Being this small, we have to be strategic about how we go about our jobs. Yet every decision, we weigh the intention of journalism, which at its most basic is to provide accurate and honest information to the public and to hold the powerful accountable. There is not a reporter in the world who hasn't made a mistake. And I certainly include myself on that list. But there is a huge difference between an honest mistake and fake news. In my experience, it's the rare journalist who's able to sleep the night before a major story is published. We wake up in a sweat, asking ourselves if we double-checked every fact, misspelled a name, or got the quotes right. Making a mistake has always been mortifying, but never more so than today, when social media puts every story under the microscope and the tiniest error is cause for outrage. Searching for mistakes in journalists' story has turned into a blood sport. If a reporter gets something wrong, it opens her up to being vilified and doubted and discounted. In journalism, as in many businesses, you are only as good as your word. If you fail at that, you may as well leave the job. Many of us live with the terror of making a mistake because the ramifications are so consequential, even if the mistake seems relatively minor. The attack of fake news seems so ironic given our assumption of honesty, so implicit in everything we do, from initial assignment, through research and reporting, right up to the final edit and fact-checking. It seems so obvious to those of us in the business, and yet I have long been aware, since my days as a young reporter, that it's not always so obvious to the public. I wonder if maybe we do a poor job of explaining ourselves. Reality is a complicated thing, and truth is something we all aim to achieve. But I want to make a distinction between honesty and truth. We, as journalists, and of course as human beings, may not always get at the truth. But most of us, unless we're compulsive liars, most of us know when we're being honest and when we're being dishonest. The truth is something else. Getting at it is a process. And when we arrive or think we've arrived, we can be challenged. Two reporters can go to the same event and come away with totally different stories. Each reporter will ask a different set of questions. He'll observe different gestures, hear different responses, take different notes, and find different things interesting. A classic example occurs in John Steinbeck's Travels with Charlie, which is about his roaming around America in a pickup truck with no one but his dog for company. Towards the end of the book, for some reason, he goes to Prague and hangs out in cafes and bars with bohemians, students, artists, regular people. When he gets on the plane to go home, he discovers that he's sitting next to Joseph Alsop, the very conservative, syndicated columnist who's also just spent a week in Prague. Alsop, however, spent it with diplomats, politicians, business leaders, the hoi polloi. These two guys, both smart observers of society, each went home with a very different story about Prague. And each, in his own way, was telling his own truth. But let me tell you a little more about this story, because this is where it gets even more interesting. A few years after Steinbeck's death, readers started to question some of the dialogue in the book. One researcher discovered that Steinbeck's wife had actually accompanied him on a lot of his travels, when really his only companion was supposed to have been his dog. There were suggestions that some of the encounters never happened. His own son publicly weighed in and said he was convinced his father never talked to many of the people he wrote about. The son, and I quote, said, "He just sat in his camper and wrote all that bullshit." At least, and here's in the interest of honesty, I think he said bullshit because the words in the New York Times story were bleeped out. So excuse me if I insult anyone in this room today, but there are too many people today sitting in their campers and basements writing bullshit and passing it off as journalism. Journalism is a craft, and it aspires to a lofty mission, which is to convey an honest account of local and world events. The kind of reporting we do at Searchlight, and what every legitimate newsroom strives to do, demands rigorous work. Lots of reading to prepare for the interviews, cold calls, digging, organizing, synthesizing, checking, and double-checking. And then you have to write, which, as the sports writer Red Smith famously said, is no big deal. You just open a vein and bleed over the keys. Finally, you think your story is done. And then comes the fun part, when your editor tears it to pieces. Asks you to clarify your words, return to your source and get a better quote, provide richer details, address a huge hole in the story. You buried your lead, and by the way, it's poorly organized. Many of our stories at Searchlight go through several rewrites before they ever see the light of day. But virtually every reporter I know at Searchlight and elsewhere understands that this is the way it is. This is the process you go through. And it's not a fail-safe process. You can go through it, and there may still be flaws in your story, but this process increases the odds that you have provided an honest account, perhaps even a close approximation of the truth. It's about slow journalism. I wish I could say I coined that word, but I didn't. Slow journalism, it's about taking the time to do a story properly and honestly. It's like slow food. You just can't rush it. So here's an example. Searchlight just sent out a story. I say sent out because we are published by 35 media organizations around the state. We sent out this story that had been in the works for about 5 months. It's about the over-medication of children with psychiatric drugs, and it focused on a particular Albuquerque psychiatrist who's now under investigation for his excessive prescribing practices. He was exposed due to the courage of an older woman, a grandmother who adopted 4 little boys after they had been taken away from their parents and placed in custody, protective custody, or foster care. Our reporter spent hours in this woman's house, listening to her story, going through thick binders full of medical records, fact-checking every single detail of the case. After answering the final fact-checking question, the grandmother, a highly educated professional, turned to the reporter and, as if she had never given it a thought, asked, "You're not going to use my name, are you?" The reporter was flabbergasted. She had already agreed not to name the boys, but in 5 months of detailed and intimate conversations with this woman, she had never once hinted that she wanted anonymity. Now, out of the blue, she was insisting that we make up a fictitious name, or at the very least, identify her as living in a city different from the one where she lived. "No way," Amy, our reporter, told her. "That would be lying. The public already is mistrustful enough. Doing something like this would play directly into the fake news argument." In the end, we compromised, but in a way we could live with. We used the grandmother's real name, but we said she was from northern New Mexico instead of naming the town. If we hadn't been able to reach that compromise, we agreed among ourselves, we would not publish at all. These kinds of obstacles are not all that uncommon in journalism. Reporters enter people's lives at what's often their most vulnerable moments. They hear their most intimate stories and try to recount those stories with fairness and honesty. At least that's what the reporters I work with strive to do. Journalism depends on access to solid, truthful information that citizens need in order to participate in a democracy. I just finished reading the financial journalist Michael Lewis's latest book, The Fifth Risk, and I was jarred by his reporting in the final pages. I'll just read this. The Environmental Protection Agency and Department of the Interior have both removed links to climate change data from their websites. The USDA has removed from its website inspection reports of businesses accused of animal abuse by the government. 2 weeks after Hurricane Maria, statistics that detailed access to drinking water and electricity in Puerto Rico were deleted from the FEMA website. And on and on. If information is willfully denied, how can journalists do their jobs? This kind of willful constraint of information exists, of course, on every level of government. Since Searchlight launched in January, we have been consistently shut out of the state government. Our subject matter is child well-being in New Mexico, and we write deeply researched stories about child poverty, child trauma, the state's failing schools, the deplorable foster care system. Virtually every one of our calls and emails to Children, Youth and Families Department, the Health Department, Human Services Department, and Public Education Department have hit a wall from the moment we began publishing. Radio silent. We have been totally shut out. We had heard about this blacklist by the governor's office. Journalists from other media laughed when we mentioned our frustration. Yeah, welcome to the club. Then yesterday, out of the blue, we got confirmation of this blacklist from an official within the government. And even though I knew it, it was so obvious. It was still shocking to hear it so blatantly confirmed. It's not just Searchlight, this official assured us. The blacklist also includes a few others, including NPR. So I guess we're in good company. As I said, Searchlight is a small organization. If we had been compelled to kill that story about psychiatric medication and the overdrugging of kids after investing 5 months of work, it would have been heartbreaking, not to mention financially devastating. Months of work down the drain with nothing to show for it. We try to be very strategic in what we pursue. We opted early on to make photography a central part of our work. We believe it's one of the most valuable ways to reach people and change minds. But here's something to think about. As important as photography is, to us and all news organizations, images can lie. And I will give you an example. The other day, I was going through a series of photographs with Don Usner. He put up a beautiful photo I'd never seen before, a young woman reading to her child. The mother looked like a young Madonna, thoughtful, serious, tender. Looking at it, I thought I could draw a line of love right between mother and child. But before I could say it, Don told me that the woman was a recovering addict who, right before he took the shot, told him, and I quote, "I don't know, I just don't feel a thing for my daughter. I wish I did, but I don't." And let me see, here's the photo. There. Yeah. This was discombobulating, to say the least, but it wasn't unique. 10 years ago, I was approached to write a book about an Iraqi woman who was declared to be the bravest person in all of Baghdad. Her name was Jumana Hanna, and she alone, of all the Iraqi men and women, had the courage to come forward after the American invasion of Baghdad, to name names and tell her story of torture and imprisonment at the hands of Saddam Hussein. The Pentagon had championed her account. The Washington Post had written a front page story about her, and she and her family had been airlifted to California by a US military jet and installed in a very nice apartment in Silicon Valley. She had just signed with a New York literary agent, the same agent who persuaded Barack Obama to write his first book, Dreams of My Father, and she needed a writer. I was fascinated. A story about a powerful woman? What could be better? But as I got to know Jumana, I started to discover numerous inconsistencies in her story. And I got a queasy feeling in my gut. Soon my reporting took a very different turn, and the piece I finally wrote about her was about a compulsive liar who fooled the American government, which, from what I could see, wanted to be fooled. Because when it comes to honesty, there's an implicit understanding. It's almost participatory. You can't tell your story if the other person isn't willing to hear and accept it. We witnessed that with the Kavanaugh hearings. Honest listening is a two-way street that hinges on receptivity. And clearly, a lot of those senators did not want to receive. But getting back to the subject of photographs and how they can misrepresent the truth. When the Post published its original story about Jumana, it ran a photograph of her at the scene of the prison where she said she'd been tied to a pole and flogged. The memory of it was overwhelming, and returning to that place was traumatic. She cried her eyes out, and the photograph captured her anguish. You can see it here. When my story ran 6 months later in Esquire, we used the very same photograph. But at that point, after we exposed her lies, that photo took on a very different meaning. It became Exhibit A in the game of false impressions. Good journalism can't be done on the cheap. It takes money and resources to send reporters out into the field and invest the kind of time that's needed for serious reporting. Which leads me to the importance of local journalism. Studies have found that Americans put more trust in their local news organizations than they do in national media. In an era when the president can brand serious factual coverage fake news and refer to journalists as the enemies of the people, nothing stands a better chance of restoring faith in the press than the presence of local reporters doing their jobs in communities where they're known, covering stories that the local people know are anything but fake. Honesty is such a lofty and fundamental concept. It's one of those core values you really have to take for granted in others until you see otherwise. It's a value you teach your child from the cradle, as much through actions and behavior as by word. I hadn't even realized until I started thinking about this talk today how much we wrestle with it every day at Searchlight, sometimes explicitly, always implicitly, in every story that we write. I wondered what I could even say about honesty. It's so obvious, and yet here I am talking for probably 20 minutes or so. But I will take questions, and Dawn also is here to talk about the honesty in photographs. And thank you.